So, hello everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University, where the 四海为学Collaborative Learning Project is based. I want to welcome you to our 13th book discussion and our 53rd event. We are going to discuss Professor David Shoemaker's Wisecracks, Humor and Morality in Everyday Life. Today we have Dr. Joanna Gomes, Professor Dimitra Amarantidou, and Professor Xiaofei. And they're all great people here to discuss the book with Professor Shoemaker. So I think we're going to have a great event. Our chair today is Yanhao Sun from was it the South Minzu University? And she's going to be our chair. So it's become a tradition here at 四海为学to give younger scholars a chance to be part of high-profile academic events by inviting them to take part as chairs or discussants. So if there are any younger scholars in the audience who wish to be part of future events, please email me. The event today will be 2 hours and end promptly at 11 p.m. Beijing time. Before getting things started and handing them over to Yanhao, I want to say a few words about the 四海为学Collaborative Learning Academic Forum. The 四海为学Collaborative Learning Project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the less productive conventional practices in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or in any form of egoism or self-promotion. We hope to curb all types of aggressive and look at me, I'm smarter than you, or don't I know so much, and similar attitudes sometimes found in academic exchanges. We might even go so far as to say that we hope to be somewhat of a counterbalance for the negative attitudes sometimes found in so-called blind reviews. While there is certainly a time and a place for anonymity, or at least the appearance of anonymity, communication in academia should just have just as much time and space for speaking to one another in more congenial and community-forming settings. The neologism 四海为学, which was created by Robin Wong, is a play on 四海为家, and we hope to keep this idea at the foreground of all of our events. The 四海为学Collaborative Learning Project seeks to accomplish these shifts in orientation during academic exchanges by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are open and honest. We hope to foster environments where people truly learn from and with one another. So before introducing our chair, I want to once again thank Professors David Shoemaker, Joanna Gomes, Dimitra Amarantidou, and Xiaofei for being with us here this evening. Our chair is Yanhao Xun, a lecturer at the School of Marxism at the South Central Minzu University. She earned her Doctor of Philosophy degree from Fudan University, and her primary research interests focus on the technological thoughts within Marxist philosophy and foreign Marxist studies. We're very happy to have you here, Yanhao. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor D'Ambrosio, for that kind introduction. Good evening or morning, everyone. I'm Sun Yanhao, and it's truly an honor to moderate today's event. Before we begin, please allow me to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor David Shoemaker. Professor Shoemaker is a Vin and William Y. Hutchinson Professor of Ethics and Public Life in the City School of Philosophy at Cornell University. His areas of research include agency and responsibility, personal identity, moral psychology, and the philosophy of humor. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Professor Shoemaker to share insights from his book, Wisecracks, Humor and Morality in Everyday Life. Professor Shoemaker, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me, for the introduction, for arranging yourselves at 9 o'clock at night, I think, in Beijing. And it's 9 a.m. here on the East Coast of the US. And I really applaud the general methods and strategy of these sorts of discussions. So I'm really looking forward to what I hope is learning from all of you today. So would you like me to just say a few words about the book, or? Okay. So the book was spurred by a sort of remark that a friend of mine made at a bar one night when I said, I'm thinking about writing about humor. And he says, well, that assumes you know something about it. And it was a kind of, to me, funny sort of insult, but it wasn't quite an insult. It was a faux insult, and it revealed something about us, that we were friends, that we were able to tease each other. And it's that kind of humor that I'm interested in. This kind of back and forth banter, teasing, ball busting that we go in for with our friends, our family, sometimes our enemies, hopefully our colleagues. And it has all these incredible values that I don't think have been sufficiently highlighted. It bonds people, brings them together, generates sympathy, and so forth. So my aim here was to write about those kinds of interchanges, which I'm calling wisecracks. And I'm calling them wisecracks to differentiate them from the extant literature on humor is almost exclusively about jokes. And jokes, that's easy because there's lots of examples of them, and they're available for you to talk about. It's much harder to remember really good wisecracks because they're taking place in interpersonal back and forth. But that's where the moral trouble arises, I think. That because wisecracks are a way of treating people, they involve intentions and motivations, and so they can be subject to moral anger, moral pushback, blame. They push moral buttons, some of these humorous exchanges. And in fact, some of those moral buttons and those, and maybe even meanness and cruelty, those are properties of the wisecrack itself that makes the wisecrack funnier sometimes. And other times it makes it less funny. So I'm just really interested in the exchange and the intersection of what I'm thinking of as comic reasons and moral reasons. So just quickly to go through the book, the first chapter, you have to kind of, when you're writing a book on humor, you have to say something about what makes things funny. And so I say something about what I think makes things funny. I offer a sentimentalist view of humor, which is to say that it's response dependent, that what makes things funny is ultimately a function of when amusement is merited. And so there has to be some kind of match with our human sensibilities. And so there are many, many different properties that go into what I call the kitchen sink, that sometimes in some weights and in combination with other properties makes things funny. But that doesn't help us as a theory. And so the real question is, what puts those properties in that sink? Incongruity, superiority, resonance, and callbacks to previous conversations, and intentions and motives. These are all things that go into the mix that make things funny. But the question is, what puts those properties in that sink? What makes those properties the funny makers? And there I say that what makes them funny is that they're the kinds of properties that human beings who are built like us with typical kind of senses of humor that have been developed and refined, those are the kinds of things that tend to amuse us. And that's about all we can say. So a sentimentalist about humor says, I can't give you a full-fledged first-order normative theory of the funny, but I can tell you why I can't give you that. And I can give you the next best thing, which is to say, here's the source of the funny. It's in, as Hume says, our breast, the human breast. In the second chapter, I try to discuss the relation between humor and morality generally. And I come up with, the sort of boring philosophical conclusion, which is that sometimes immoral properties in a wisecrack can make it less funny, but sometimes it can make it more funny. And it works in the opposite direction too. Sometimes comic properties in an immoral event can make that moral event less morally upsetting, and sometimes it can make it more morally upsetting. So it's a moderate comic moralism or immoralism that I eventually argue for. And then I'm interested in the middle part of the book to try to talk about three different general kinds of seemingly immoral properties that can, in interaction with some comic properties, make things funny. And I try to defend some morally troublesome humor. So I talk first about deception in leg pulling. When I'm pulling your leg, I'm leading you down the garden path. I'm deliberately deceiving you, and that's the only way the thing can ultimately be funny. It's when the reveal happens. Ah, you were just pulling my leg. That funniness has to come out of genuine deception. And so some have tried to say, well, that's not real deception. It's not something that we should morally worry about, but it is. The only way it works is if it's genuine deception, and in many cases, outright lies. So there, I want to try to justify that kind of deceptive humor as very often morally permissible, and I have to do so by citing some values of engaging in that kind of humor. One of which is it helps us build up our epistemological framework, that it better enables us to, not fall for what's false. So there are values here, and of course there are great values in engaging in this kind of humor with your friends and family. It has a bonding function. So I think that's easily defensible. The next two are not perhaps so easily defensible, but I try. The first has to do with mockery, and in particular the property of meanness that I think is one of the constituent properties of the funny of mockery. If mockery is funny, then it's got to have a little sting to it. And so what mockery is doing is it's highlighting for public consumption and ridicule and laughter some flaw of yours, say if I'm mocking you. So I'm making fun of you, drawing attention to some failure of yours. And the funniness includes that sting. It's aiming at a certain kind of sting. And if it doesn't have that sting, it's not mockery. Maybe it's just kind of back and forth teasing. And so one would think, ordinarily, if you're aiming deliberately to sting somebody, to hurt them a little bit, to draw public attention to a flaw of theirs, that there's some immorality there. And again, I try to defend some forms and examples of mockery, even though there's meanness in it. And that's because sometimes the comic reasons and the reasons to engage in this kind of humor are very valuable. And so I start with talking about mocking of friends and family, and we do this all the time, actually. And it's the kind of thing that sometimes in families only we can do with each other. And for many families in the US, I know this in the Midwest, having grown up there, for some families, it's the only way they can say, I love you to each other. Saying those actual words is very, very difficult for some people in my neck of the woods. And then finally, the third property here is the most troubling for many people, and it's exploitation of stereotypes. And these may be race or sex stereotypes, and to exploit them in service of the funny. And after a very tortured discussion of a very difficult topic, I come to the, again, kind of philosophically boring conclusion that some exploitation of this kind is morally okay. It depends heavily on the context in which it takes place. It depends heavily on the motivations and intentions of the parties that are engaged in it. But in some circumstances, it could be morally okay. And then I move on to talk about good and bad senses of humor. And here I start with people who have bad senses of humor. And it's in virtue of an impairment. So psychologists have put into various kinds of categories humor styles. They've come up with 4 humor styles. And 2 of them correlate positively with well-being, and 2 of them correlate negatively with well-being. So affiliative humor is mostly the kind I've been talking about. It's a back and forth interpersonal banter and teasing and so forth, where people are mutually vulnerable to the, let's say, mockery or teasing. And then there's self-enhancing humor, which is really about people who tend to use humor to cope with the traumas and travails of the world. There's a lot of that going around also in my neck of the woods right now, or attempts anyway. And then there's self-denigrating humor. These are people who are attracted to humor that puts them up as the butt of the joke, and that's no good for their well-being because it hurts to be a punching bag. And then there's aggressive humor, which is exactly what you think it is. It's see, cruel sarcasm, ridicule, put downs, that kind of thing. Now, of course, all of these different styles overlap, but these are just categories into which people tend to find most funny or find most amusing. And they started looking at these categories really to find out how different personality types fit in, what kinds of senses of humor different personality types have. And they started with the dark triad, which consists in narcissists, Machiavellians who just like pulling people's puppet strings to see for their own amusement, and narcissists. And of course, they're all overwhelmingly attracted to aggressive humor, almost exclusively the kind of humor that they engage in. So it tends to correlate negatively with their well-being, and it's for obvious reasons. People don't want to be around somebody who's making fun of them relentlessly and ridiculing them relentlessly. So I think that they have a bad sense of humor. And the reason is they don't see reasons to engage in the affiliative humor that I think brings all the positive benefits of comedy in our lives. They don't see reasons to be mutually vulnerable to someone else's teasing because they think, well, I'm better than them. They shouldn't, they have no right to make fun of me. I'm better than them. So what's going on in their case is they have a flawed sense of humor in the same way that I have flawed eyesight. There's nothing pejorative about the judgment. It's just I have poor eyesight. I need aids. And they have a poor sense of humor, and it's in virtue of their empathy impairments. They're not capable of appreciating from someone else's perspective when too much is too much. They don't know where that line is that many people know with respect to their friends and family. They can see, she's getting a little upset. I better pull back. Members of the dark triad can't do that. They score off the charts in Schadenfreude. They love it when anyone has some kind of downfall. They think it's hilarious. So that's an impairment that they have, and that's what impairs their senses of humor. But there are people who have or who are fully capacitated for empathy, but nevertheless have that same sort of flawed sense of humor. And these are the people who see only comic reasons in the world, and they always dismiss the moral reasons that are also in those purportedly humorous events. They dismiss them by saying, oh, come on, it was just a joke. Lighten up, that kind of stuff. And those are people I call buffoons. That's a pejorative. On the other end, then there are people who have some difficulty in a certain kind of perspective taking. And these are people with autism on certain parts of the autism spectrum who may have difficulty taking up the perspective of others, and so have some difficulty with a certain kind of back and forth social-based humor where we're sort of insulting each other with a straight face. That just sounds straight up like an insult. And so there are, again, certain kinds of impairments with perspective taking and so forth. So there's no pejorative. But there are people who are fully capacitated who have similar kind of responses. And so they think whenever there are moral reasons in play, there can't be any comic reasons. And so these are people I call prigs. So this is the ones who say, whenever there's a little bit of, say, meanness or sting to the mockery, they say, oh, that's not funny. That's not funny. And I think they're making a mistake, and it's a mistake that's criticizable. And so these are the people I call prigs. And so the last chapter then is an attempt to try to help the prig get a better sense of humor and help all of us have access to a lot of valuable goodies in the world by taking a different perspective on the world and to start seeing more of the absurdity in the world in which we live. And it turns out that the example of first responders, say, ER doctors and nurses and firefighters and murder detectives, they have a famously ghoulish, morbid sense of humor. And what they're doing is making light of a situation that would ordinarily be emotionally distressing. It would be emotionally crippling for many people to have to deal with all of the death and goriness that they have to deal with on a regular basis. And they appeal to humor, and they appeal to a specific kind of absurdist humor. And they're able to then emotionally dampen their distress. And it has this remarkable, this has been well studied by social psychologists, and it has a remarkable result which preserves their cognitive focus on the task at hand. So ordinarily, if we're presented and we're not first responders and we're presented with someone who's got stab wounds that is gushing blood, it would just be overwhelming for most of us emotionally. We wouldn't be able to deal with it. Humor is, in fact, what helps them to deal with it. It dampens down their distress, enables them to focus on their job, and so has moral benefits, because what it enables them to do is help others, and help others more efficiently, more effectively than they would if they were overwhelmed by the distress. So I urge at the end that we try to see more funny in the world around us, because it has significant prudential and moral benefits. Okay, I should stop there.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Shoemaker, for that engaging introduction to the book. Next, we'll transition to our discussion. We are fortunate to have three distinguished scholars joining us today. First up is Dr. Karolina-Dzhoanna Gomes. Dr. Gomes is a postdoctoral researcher at East China Normal University, Shanghai, with a PhD from Ural Federal University, Russia. Her dissertation was devoted to public conflicts over offensive art. Her research interests include ethical, aesthetic discourse around art, the effective public sphere, and cultural conflicts in the age of algorithm-driven social media. Dr. Gomes, we look forward to hearing your thoughts, please.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And first and foremost, I want to thank Professor Shoemaker for writing this this book, because I really enjoyed reading it, not only as someone who's interested in the topic from the academic perspective, but it was a really nice read. I chuckled a lot throughout this book, and I feel like it's very demanding to write about humor, and just to balance the certain like academic jargon and in general the analytic the arguments of analytic philosophy that can be sometimes very dry, but also you added a lot of personal stuff there as well, and humor. So thank you. I think it's just a masterclass on how you can write on humor. And so now I have some notes prepared, and just moving on to some points that I wanted to discuss. And throughout this book, the idea is woven that wisecracks, which Professor Shoemaker defines as typically improvised bits of spontaneous conversational and interpersonal wit, that wisecracks, they're risque from a moral standpoint, but are still rewarding. So that its offensive wisecracks, quote, may be so funny that the reason they generate for amusement could outweigh whatever moral reasons there might conceivably be against their offensiveness. And gradually throughout this book, you convincingly present a set of arguments in support of this claim. For example, in chapter 2, there are arguments of moralists of art. It is the area, because I can make a disclaimer that I'm not specializing in humor. However, a lot of arguments made by new moralists and immoralists of art, they apply, I think, both to the sphere of humor and to art as well. And so there are some arguments by Noel Carroll, who's a moderate moralist, the more hardcore moralist version by Barry Scott, but it seems that you more are in agreement with the immoralism of art proposed by Daniel Jacobson, that moral defects in some forms of cultural expression, such as art, can be not only merits from an aesthetic perspective, but also they can be morally advantageous in the long run, because they provide us with a morally complex worldview, basically helping us to see the world from different perspectives, to drag us out from the confinements of our own ego. And this is why empathy also plays a huge role in the book, and is also a big part of how we can manage to make Wisecracks successful. And the empathy requires this balance between not being overly condescending, as you mentioned, not to be a prig, but also not to be a buffoon, and which also implies some level of refinement in our humor sensibilities. And which also seems like it marries this approach to Wisecracks with the paradox of negative emotions. For instance, I think it was a couple of weeks ago in the collaborative learning project also had a discussion on the paradox of negative emotions and paradox of tragedies, and how we can engage with something that evokes negative emotions like disgust or shock, for instance. And while we can transgress those conventional boundaries, it can help us to overcome certain traumatic aspects. And as was mentioned by Professor Shoemaker in the very powerful chapter number 7, that there are basically no taboo topics. It just depends on how we approach various topics, and that even something as traumatic as rape or serious illness can have the potential cathartic function and help bond with other people and overcome trauma. And which also reminded me of the point that some studies on painful art make too, that some of the examples of great art, like masterpieces of tragedy, are great precisely because they treat readers or viewers or listeners as adults. They're not patronizing or didactic. And if we talk about Wisecracks, we have to make this basically leap of faith that the sting that we are making is going to land with the precision. And now I want to invite you to this discussion, Professor Shoemaker, because as was mentioned earlier, there is this debate between ethics and aesthetics, and it can be applied to both art and to humor as well. But from the perspective of the aesthetic study, and as someone who has a background in art or oriented background, we sometimes tend to consider the aesthetic experience as an autonomous sphere. Thus, in a lot of cases, when members of the public are offended by some content, be that an art piece or a joke, there is always this defense. Oh, you just don't get it. You just are an unprepared viewer. If we talk about art exhibitions, that the offense is always in the eyes of a viewer or in the ears of the listener, questioning whether the displeased reaction to some shocking, disturbing content in art is a reaction of moral nature at all, whether moral judgment even takes place here. And my question to you is, because I personally don't agree with this criticism, but I was met a lot with this question of why, when we talk about controversial art, for instance, we say that the negative reaction to it is of a moral nature. And even in the book, you mentioned that offense is a response to shock or affronts to one's senses of decorum, one's senses of smell, of hearing, or to one's moral, religious, or aesthetic sensibilities. Because sometimes we can react to a wisecrack negatively based on its just being made of a poor taste. For instance, I have this example. A couple of years ago, I went to a stand-up comedy, and it was not made by professionals. So a lot of performers, they were kind of nervous, and they just a lot of jokes, they didn't land well. And one performer started to make a crowd work. And so it was kind of a wisecracks that were very spontaneous. And one of the members of the audience was a girl who was just a perfect audience member, because she was very active. She was ready to be a butt of a joke in any any routines of other performers. But it seems like this one particular performer, he was very nervous, and at a certain point he became very aggressive and started to just sorry, but be a jerk. So he was just very malicious, and it didn't land well, of course. Everyone was kind of confused. No one was laughing. And at the time, I realized that I wasn't judging him on a moral level, but my reaction to this was more of, oh, this is just of a poor taste. So it's aesthetically offensive that if you get nervous and then you get angry and react to this with such like very aggressive attitude. So yeah, if you can comment maybe on this, Professor Shoemaker, what would you say about this question of whether this problem with offensive jokes is usually with comic reasons versus moral reasons?
Yeah, that's super interesting. And you go by Karolina-Dzhoanna or just Joanna?
Dzhoanna, just Dzhoanna.
Dzhoanna, okay. This is really, really interesting. And I should say right now that, or right up front, my views on all of this are evolving, and so I really am interested in hearing what people think, because Wisecrack was a first crack at it, and I want to just try to get things right. So the field of aesthetics in general, I do draw some from that. I think it's terrifically valuable to pay attention to those debates that have been going on. So how are we to think of the interaction between morality, let's say, and comedy, or morality and beauty, or something that would be a more purely aesthetic description? And I think there's a fundamental difference between works of art and jokes, the jokes on the page. And I think that's because, and maybe this is a controversial aesthetic view, but works of art have built into them basically the intention of the artist. And jokes don't. And the jokes we can just find on the internet, and we don't know who wrote them, we don't know why they wrote them or anything. So there's a better case for autonomism in the joke field than I think there is in the art field more generally. So I think that these properties, I mean, a lot of artists are aiming to shock you or aiming to offend you, and that's built into the artwork. And so now how are we to think of what these properties are and how they interact? So that's basically to reject autonomism for the most part, and to say that there can be properties that are in the artwork that are unsettling, or now we go through a variety of possible responses: offensive, unsettling, nauseating. I have a graduate student who's writing about nausea in Nabokov's Lolita, and so it's a very, very cool project. So let's focus on the kinds of responses that people have to the thing, and it's in virtue of the properties of the thing, and you can't extricate those properties from the thing and still have it be a good work of art. And there are just a huge variety of responses that we might have. And so you think there are cases in which it's just cringy, or the poor taste example, um, and the offended reaction. All of these are perfectly, I think, legitimate reactions in some cases that we have reasons to respond with those. And in fact, that's what the artist has built into it for us to have that kind of reaction, but also to see the relevant aesthetically good properties and that they might outweigh. Or in an all things considered response, you take both of those into account, and then you have a very complicated aesthetic response. The hard part, and I think the impossible part, although I don't say this in the book, is to mark the different normative domains as such. To say that what's being tweaked right now is in the aesthetic domain. What's being tweaked right now is offense. Is it moral or non-moral? Good Lord, I have no idea, because I can be offended aesthetically, let's say. I can be offended morally. But it's hard. You can't give, I think, a hard and fast distinction between these normative domains. I think they just kind of blend into each other. So it's much better for us just to look at the kinds of responses that are appropriate. So I've stopped talking in terms of there being moral reasons for upset. Instead, I much prefer to talk now about what I call blamey reasons. And these are reasons in a wisecrack to respond in a kind of blamey way, but there are just a massive number of different ways we can respond in the blamey way. We can respond with upset, with anger, with finger pointing, with criticism, with silent treatment, turning my back, walking away. All of these fall under the rubric, I think, of blamey reasons. And they're built into wisecracks. They're also built into works of art. And that's the way they get their power sometimes. So I guess I'm rejecting autonomism, but I'm also rejecting that there's a hard and fast distinction between the kinds of responses that we might, kinds of negative responses that we might have, because I'm skeptical about the possibility of drawing hard and fast distinctions between those domains. I hope that's clear. It's a super interesting comparison to talk more widely. People aren't quite sure what to do with humor, and I think some people do wind up putting it in the aesthetics camp. But I'm not sure it fits there, really. I don't know where to put it. It's an odd and funny thing. But they generate distinctive kinds of reasons, both for amusement and for this other set of negative reactions. And so there are two things we need to figure out here. One is how those different kinds of reasons weigh against each other, so we can figure out the all things considered response. And then there are reasons to engage in a certain kind of humor so that I'm going to be vulnerable to amusement, say, at things that might also make me cringe or morally upset. And it's those external reasons that have to do with the values of bonding and coping with the world and so forth, but they're not going to affect the nature of the comic reasons or the reasons for upset. It was a little rambly, but I hope that spoke to some of the things you were interested in.
Yes, this was very helpful. Thank you a lot.
Thank you.
I'm just I'm not sure if I oh, Yanhao, I think it's your
Oh,
microphone.
yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor Shoemaker and Dr. Gomes, for that. Oh, sorry, for that insightful discussion. Now let's turn to our second discussant, Professor Dimitra Amarantidou. Professor Amarantidou taught Chinese and comparative philosophy at East China Normal University, Shanghai Normal University, and other institutions. She currently teaches Chinese and comparative philosophy at the University of Macau. Her research focuses on irony and paradox in early Chinese thought, early Confucianism, East-West comparative philosophy, and translation. Professor Amarantidou, please take the floor.
Thank you, Yanhao. Is it possible to be able to see Professor Shoemaker? while I talk? How is that possible? Because now I see you, Yanhao. Oh, I guess I can. Yeah. All right. Hello, Professor Shoemaker. Can I call you David? Dave?
Yeah, you can call me Dave.
Yes, I'm Dimitra. Thank you very much. I'm just echoing what Joanna said. Anybody who writes a book-length thing on humor is a hero, I think. Yes, I have some points to share. I come somehow from another world, let's say, or yeah, let's call it another discourse. So yeah, if some of my points and some of the underlying assumptions sound weird to you, then yeah. But I can see you're very open to anything, and I really enjoy actually listening to you live. Your voice is different from your book voice. It's kind of different. It's more relaxed. It's more your book voice is a little bit more I don't know, restrictive in a way. So first point I want to make, disclaimer here, I'm not for DEI. I'm not a supporter of any kind of DEI way of thinking, but I have to say this, that I have noticed recently. I teach a class on humor here at the University of Macau, and I noticed that all the books about Chinese humor have the word Chinese on their cover, like Chinese humor in Chinese life and culture, humor in Chinese life and letters, or humor in Chinese, right? But when a Westerner writes on humor, they just right, they say humor, right? And they somehow speak on behalf of all humanity. So of course, as you recognize, there is a way in which we can look at humor as a human universal, right? But there is also a way in which we can't. So there are limits to this. And I think, yeah, I think it's really fun to just yeah, to recognize these limitations and like to also play with our own yeah, with our own proposals in a way. So that was my first point, because yeah, this is also my area of study, right? Like, what is Chinese humor? I'm also trying to understand, because I'm not Chinese, I'm Greek, and I'm just living in China for many years. So somehow I'm also like trying to understand the humor in your book, right? It's not so self-evident to me that some of these things are funny. I mean, in Greece, we also sometimes we have a pejorative term for some American jokes, right? We say, oh, that joke was so American. It was cold. We call them cold, like they don't touch us somehow, right? They're so this is one aspect, of course, and it's not such a big one. Just the kind of awareness I want to bring in. The second point is about the distinction you are making, which is somehow driving, is the basis of this book, right? And it's driving the discussion, which is between jokes and wisecracks. So this distinction, you also recognize, of course, that it has its problems. And I wonder why it is so necessary for you to make this distinction. Why it's so necessary to put wisecracks in the sphere of morality, like to make them somehow more pertinent to moral issues and yes, and moral trouble, right? And to treat jokes as, like you say, as canned, as somehow belonging to a sphere where morality is not at play. How is it possible to decontextualize even those structured and, you know, like these scripted, right, chunks of funniness. How is it possible to decontextualize them? So, for example, you say that in the context of at the point when you say, sorry. Yes, you say that these jokes can be fully and equally recognized in whether you hear them from someone where somebody tells them to you, or you're overhearing someone tell it to someone else, whether you hear it on TV, right? You can fully and equally recognize them, right? As if they are somehow in some void, and they're not touched by contextual, by situational particulars. And I'm wondering, right, if you take the Moronistan joke that you use, right? If you take the Moronistan joke, and if that joke is posted by Trump in this historical moment, right, with all the discussion about the global market turmoil. So if he posted a thing like that, then doesn't that become a whole different story? I mean, it is still scripted, but it's rooted in reality, like in such an inescapable way that I think that makes the distinction a little bit, a little bit more loose, let's say, or somehow not that convincing. How do we draw this line between this wisecracks as totally dependent on the interpersonal relations and the situational particulars, right? And they're only possible between people who know each other, and then the jokes on the other hand are more like somehow independent of all those things. And then what would you say about the jokes that you use in your book? I mean, I don't know you and you don't know me, but somehow they work, right? They work. What are they? They're wisecracks, right? They're wisecracks. You call them wisecracks, but there is no relation. I mean, there is no interpersonal content, right, necessary for us to somehow communicate, let's say, in this way, right? So, I'm just wondering, why is this distinction so necessary for you? This is the second point. And the third point is, you say faux insults can be, in the context of you saying that faux insults can be funny from somebody we know, but real insults can be funny also from somebody we know, right? And in this context, you say, suppose I've already self-published 5 books on humor, each of them worse and more unfunny than the previous one. And I start with a very simple, even silly sounding question. Do books on humor have to be funny, you think? I don't think so. I mean, books on surrealism don't have to be surreal, and whatever, right? Books on sex don't have to be erotic, right? So why am I saying this? Because I think there is an assumption there. There's something deeper, and I think you also imply this in the discussion and in this proposal about pursuing this wisecracking life. There is this assumption that being funny is always somehow an act of the individual will. And that somehow goes against the idea of the wisecrack, which is, like you said, spontaneously emerging, right, in our interactions with the people we know. So, on the one hand, somehow it seems that being funny is an expression of the will, right? It's an expression of my agency and my moral agency, right, for that matter. And whether my book is funny or not, again, is somehow totally depends entirely on my authorial choices, right? And my skill, right? Or the lack thereof, right? In being funny. And yeah, what happens to spontaneity when you are proposing, right? This, like you say, this wisecracking life. What is this proposal? How is this proposal practicable? Like, what does it mean to embrace this proposal? To become more tolerant to people like wisecracking, or us somehow cultivating this? Again, through an act of the will. And finally, also a small point, the kitchen sink definition. The kitchen sink definition, which seems like, David, it seems like you just put everything in there. Everything is there, right? In the kitchen sink, to the point that it somehow doesn't look like a definition anymore. I mean, it's incongruity is there, emotions are there, empathy is there, intention is there, like everything is there. So it somehow is like not that useful. And again, why is it necessary? Why do you need this to demarcate this like in this way? So yeah, that's it. These were my points of discussion. I really look forward to hearing you talk more about this.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. There's a lot here to think about and to maybe discuss some. So I'll try to go through these in order. The point about focus on Chinese humor, or the pretension on my part to speak of all of humanity and the humor conditions for all human beings, given the perfect possibility of the cold American jokes. And this is in work I've been recently trying to develop more. Yeah, I do have something of a view that tends towards universalism. And I think that disagreements that we've got about humor are a function of a variety of what I call obscuring factors or obstructions. And so big amongst those are epistemic obstructions. There's certain facts I don't know, comprehension obstructions. I just don't get what's going on here, or I don't get the background that I need to sufficiently understand the thing as funny. But there are also cultural obstructions, that we've been raised in certain ways and we see certain properties in certain ways that it's hard not to see in those ways. There are ideological obstructions, so that's a function of typically of our political or moral leanings. There are explicitly moral obstructions. I think that's what's happening with the prigs. And I think there are mattering obstructions. This is what I just touch on in the final chapter, which is that people are so invested in certain kinds of things, and the funny might be found if we can just step away from that perspective of it's meaning so much to us, or it's mattering so much to us. We can see there's a kind of absurdity there. So there's tons and tons of obstructions. Plus, you have to have a developed sense of humor, to be able to have some sense of discrimination. And if you put that all together, then my optimistic speculation is that if we can rid ourselves of all of these obstructions, come to see the properties more or less as the other person does, then we'll both recognize by our own lights that the thing is funny. It's also crucial that finding something to be funny is compatible with both being amused by it, or merely recognizing or seeing that it's amusing without yourself being amused by it. And so in this way, you can describe jokes from different cultures and say, yeah, here's all the information you have to have. And maybe I come to see, oh, okay, I get it. Now, once you've done all that dissecting work, it's very unlikely that I'm going to be amused, but I think we're agreeing that it's amusing. And that's the theory that I'm trying to bring out. Now, that's not to say that we won't, at the end of the day, after ridding ourselves of all of these obstructions, have some radical disagreement. I think that's perfectly possible. It may just be that this is the kind of humor that moves me, and this is the kind of humor that moves you. And even if we've removed all the obstructions, I think of yours, and you think the same thing of mine. That's possible. But the main aim is to say that we can get pretty close universally by removing the obstructions that keep us from seeing the properties as other people do. So that's one thought. And so then to restrict the discussion just to Chinese humor, which I don't think is happening in these cases. I think this highlighting certain kind of distinctive features of Chinese humor, but that it would be a kind of humor that anyone could come to see as funny, even if they themselves aren't amused by it. So I would be skeptical that there is a distinct form of humor that only one culture sees as funny and everyone else is totally flummoxed by. So that's one thought there. And actually, it may go to this goes to the kitchen sink discussion at the end. So I'll continue there. So the dialectic of that chapter is, here are the monistic theories that lots of people had put forward in the past as objective properties. They're unified. They unify all of humor, and they are the funny makers. And so people will say it's superiority, says Hobbes. I see someone slip and fall. I see I'm superior to him. Ha 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 ha. This is what Hobbes derisively calls the cause of those grimaces we call laughter. So you could see Hobbes was not a huge fan. And then but there are plenty of counterexamples to that. There are cases of superiority that aren't funny. If you're driving, you have to be driven from the airport in a very poverty-stricken village in a limo. You're driving through it and you're seeing yourself as superior to the many poor people there. There's nothing funny about that. And there are plenty of cases of humor that don't involve any superiority, just a knock-knock joke. For example, incongruity is another one. People say every single bit of humor has to have this incongruous property. And in fact, having the incongruous property makes the thing funny. Well, that's just false. It's very incongruous when I come home to find the door open and my family slaughtered. Ooh, didn't expect that. That is not funny. And I think there are plenty of cases of funny that don't involve any incongruity. Anyway, so I think every single one of these theories that's been offered, the monistic theories, they capture something. They capture some kinds of humor, but they can't capture them all. And none of them individually is sufficient to make things funny. So I say, well, let's help them out. Maybe let's gather them together and we'll have a really pluralistic theory. And while we're at it, let's add all these other properties that we think make things funny, throw them all into the kitchen sink, add some that I haven't thought of. And then the theory says, okay, if something involves any of these properties and maybe in some combination and some weight with respect to each other, every instance of humor is going to involve one of these properties in some combination in some kind of weight. Okay, great. Now we've got a coextensive. We've found how our theory is coextensive with all that is funny and only that which is funny. But the theory doesn't explain when and with what weight any of those individual properties is pertinent. And so you're exactly right. It's not a theory. It's not a theory that does any explanatory work at all. All we've done is put together a huge list of disjunctive properties. So what we need then is to ask ourselves, why these properties and not some others? And the best way to do that, I think, is to appeal to the human sense of humor. These are the kinds of things that typical humans with well-developed and refined senses of humor will tend to find funny. That's the best we could do. It's impossible to give a first-order theory. So you're exactly right. So I'm trying to be as sympathetic as possible to those views and just say, in the end, no approach like this will work. And here's why. Because none of them makes essential reference to the human breast, as Hume has said. Got to make essential reference to our sense of humor. So then the I guess related question is, why is it necessary for me to make this distinction between jokes and wisecracks? As you rightly point out, that it is a rough and ready distinction. I can't give you necessary and sufficient conditions. All I could do are give you typicality and paradigmatic cases. I just want you to recognize the phenomenon. Sometimes when we're engaged, and the phenomenon here is essentially rests on intention and motive. That's part of the deal when we're talking about wisecracks. Jokes don't, either in and of themselves, or if the intention of someone to tell a joke is just to liven up a party or something like that. There's intention there, and that might make it into the world of wisecracks as a result. And I'll say more about that in a second. But jokes on the page or in the cloud or wherever, I think they are completely decontextualized. And as a result, they're amoral. That the only property they might have is funniness. So a joke, as it were, that you find in the wild might be funny or not. But that's it. That's the only kind of appraisal that can be made of it. A moral appraisal can't be made of it until it's told. And the moral appraisal there is going to the person's intention in telling the joke. Why are you bringing up this joke now, I might ask, as you've interrupted the conversation that we were having such a good time, and you say, oh, this reminds me. And then you tell the joke that you think might be pertinent to the conversation. It really just stops the conversation. We wait politely. At the end, we laugh, and then we go back to the conversation. Or that joke might be used as a cudgel. So there's one joke in the chapter on stereotypes. Let's see if I can remember it. This is another reason I prefer wisecracks. I'm terrible at remembering jokes. What do 10,000 battered women have in common? They should have listened. Now, that joke can be wielded in various ways and in various contexts. And I think that depending on the context, it can be defensible. But a very close friend of mine said that she can no longer even read that joke because it was once used as a cudgel against her by a guy who was hitting on her at the bar. And he kept repeating it and repeating it and repeating it until she became terrified and had to call the cops. So notice it's a huge difference in context in those cases. I think both of them will fall under the rubric of wisecracks, though. So I don't want to say that there can't be an official joke as part of a wisecrack. Sure, there can. And so Trump can make the Moranistan joke, and in so doing, rally the troops, and get everybody laughing that's on his side. It's aimed at doing something. And so that's what wisecracks typically are, especially when I'm kind of mocking or teasing you. I know what you can take. I know how far I can go, but I know this is going to get under your skin a little bit, and that's what makes it funny. And that can be done with just a spontaneous witticism, but it can also be done by repeating the joke that you had to call the cops on. So, yes, I agree. I think just in general, we can see that there's a difference here, that the jokester brings up things. Oh, it's a lull in the conversation. Oh, did you hear the one about? And then, blah, 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 versus the much more natural cases in which we're just going back and forth and the banter is flowing and I come up with a great witticism and you love it and you top me and so forth and back and forth. And there what we're doing is intending to lean in. We're intending to increase the enjoyment that we're sharing with each other. And that has independent moral value, I think. So I hope that makes things clearer. And it also would suggest that as I said, I think that some jokes can be completely decontextualized, and in so doing, they're amoral. Okay, I made that point. Now, the act of will that's involved in being funny versus the spontaneous stuff. I hope that maybe what I've said is probably going to predict what I'll say here, that the spontaneity is just as related to, is just a function of an act of will as deciding to engage in a wisecracking life. It may be that I've got the perfect quip. And I'm waiting. I've got it. I hope tonight that the topic turns to this thing over here and to your great success that has happened recently. And I've got it. And boom, it happens and it comes right out, flows off the tip of my tongue. Everybody is dying with hilarity. It was perfect. That was just planned. It was planned spontaneity. But the spontaneous part was that it came up in the course of a conversation and it moved the conversation along. And I'm thinking that that's what a really great wisecrack can do. It's much rarer for a good joke to be able to do that. I mean, what good jokes often do is spur someone else to say, "Oh yeah, that reminds me of this other joke," and now we're just relaying jokes to each other. That's its own kind of conversation, but it's not the kind of rich conversation that I think wisecracks bring, and that's where the value comes from. I hope all that was clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Yes, it was very clear. Yeah, if I can follow up, Yanhao, with the last question.
Mhm.
Do I have a couple of minutes? Can I ask a follow-up question?
If it's up to me, I say yes, but I don't think it's up to me.
Yanhao? Yanhao? Yes? Do I have a couple of minutes to ask a question? Oh,
She's a
she's
bit frozen. Yeah.
Yeah, go,
Just-
Dimitra, go for it. Go for it.
Yeah. David, just one last point, right? Like the point about genuine deception, right? That when there is like some immorality there, right, involved, like genuine deception, you are really deceiving someone and you are pulling their leg, and this is somehow part of the joke, right? And you say that genuine deception, even though it's not moral, can be morally permissible, right? In this case, and of course it is necessary component somehow, right, or the condition of funniness. So my question is, if this deception, like the moment it becomes part of this function, right, if it is somehow, like, if I can say, if it is somehow humorized, right, like if deception and humor somehow are more porous in a way, so that the deception is not deception anymore, it's not genuine deception, right, it's humorized deception, it's a playful kind of deception, right? And on the other hand, right, like the humor is a deceptive kind of like humor, it's a deceptive playfulness, and it's a playful deception. So can we think of these two as porous, so we don't have this like stark distinction, like it's immoral but it becomes somehow morally permissible because it produces funniness?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So I'm just describing the starkest case, where what's necessary to the funny is that you were genuinely deceived for a few seconds. And so one example is my son-in-law asked me who are my favorite comedians, and I told him, I said, "What about you? Who's on your Mount Rushmore of comedians?" And he named three of the worst comedians of all time, or like the really lame comedians. Carrot Top was one, and I was stunned. And I said, "Oh, okay." While I'm internally thinking, my assessment of my son-in-law has just dropped precipitously. If you enjoy that kind of humor, there's something wrong with you. And then he just kind of smirked. He said, "Oh, you didn't believe that, did you?" And then, of course, there's the hilarity. So that's the start case, in which the funniness depends on my having fallen for it. But I think you're absolutely right. There are other cases in which, especially with close friends, they know the stories, that they know everything about each other, that I say something with a very straight face. It's a bald-faced lie, and you can see through it, but you like the attempt. Then there's funny there, even though there's been no official reveal. That's probably a case with a lot of what's they call garden path humor, leading you down the garden path, pulling your leg, this kind of thing. Mostly it's like, I'm not sure what to think. Oh, wait. And a lot of times we'll just say, are you serious with that? And then crack a smile and say, okay. So people, they're suspicious, and haven't fully been deceived. So those are all these intermediate cases. But it's just to say what kind of deception are we talking about? And the kind of deception we're talking about in those cases is genuine immoral deception, at least according to Kant. Although I've heard otherwise. Last week I was in Austin, and Kant scholar there was telling me that it's hard to say whether or not Kant is inconsistent, but he says explicitly when writing about jokes, you got to deceive the other person. And I'm thinking, what? That's not the Kant I've ever heard of. And so he might be making an exception for jokes, which would be very, very weird because he doesn't make an exception for the murderer at the door case. You're not allowed to laugh at, or not allowed to lie to that person. So I don't know. I mean, Kant is Kant. He's his own thing.
Thank you, David. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you for this.
Okay, I guess I will just introduce myself.
Yeah, we've lost our host.
First of all, thank you, Paul, for organizing this wonderful event. And thank you, Yanhao, for the introduction you would have made. I know you prepared. Hello, Dave, if I may.
Hi. Yes.
It's such a great pleasure meeting you. I have read your papers on moral responsibility, especially the three notions of responsibility, the three concepts of responsibility. I enjoyed a lot. And thanks for this wonderful book. I read it with great enjoyment and sometimes amusement. I have basically two major questions, one clarificatory and one maybe a little bit critical. The first one has something to do with your metaphysical view about funniness, and the second one has to do with your universalism. So let me start with the first one. Right after you introduce this human theory of humor, you made a claim that you think funniness or amusement is a single unified property. I think I probably want to ask you to make a few clarifications on this. As far as I can see, the reason why you make this claim is that you think comic reasons and moral reasons are two distinct type of reasons. And of course, if amusement is a kind of a single unified response, that sort of metaphysically explains it nicely. I guess maybe I'm wrong about that. And that plays a role in your rejection to the so-called hardcore moralism, i.e. blameworthy immorality in wisecracks always eliminate or reduce their funniness. So let me ask my first question, which is about your claim that funniness is, I quote, a general property appraised as funny by a single unified response, namely amusement. Let me start with a couple of scenarios which I find funny. So one scenario, suppose there's an old lady walking happily in the street, and all of a sudden she falls on the ground awkwardly. And that feels funny. It's one scenario. And here's another scenario. I guess a couple of days ago, the US Vice President J.D. Vance made this comment about Chinese peasant. He said the US borrowed money from Chinese peasants to buy the manufacturers made by those Chinese peasants. And after that, a Chinese blogger tweeted this, which I find funny. Have you said thank you for the money we lent you? Now, I find both scenarios funny, but somehow I feel like they are sort of different in nature. For example, the second kind of funniness I think there is some moral sentiment embedded in it, which seems to be absent in the first scenario. So this leads me to my first question, that is, I wonder if you can say a little bit more about what do you mean by funniness as a single unified response? Off the top of my mind, I can think of a few worries. For example, I might say, you know, the brain regions which sort of which are causally responsible for my feeling funny in those two scenarios could be very different, for example. And the second worry is that if funniness is a single unified property, then it might seem that in principle, we should have a unified measure of degree of funniness, but that seems a bit suspicious to me. And another reason is that how funny we find things are often intricately related to what kind of current mood we have, what kind of moral beliefs we have. So let me give you an example. For example, use this old lady case again. Suppose you see this old lady walk carelessly in the street, and then in front of her there is a ice surface of a frozen water, for example, and it appears to you that she didn't pay attention to that or something, and you become very, very nervous. And you almost shouted out to her, "Watch out!" And then all of a sudden, she makes a very elegant jump and starts to, dance. It's like a prank or something, right? So that makes you laugh. And the reason I think in that case, I find it funny, it requires my anxiety in the first place. If I were not so anxious, I wouldn't find this situation funny. So it seems that the kind of anxiety, this sort of mood, is a prerequisite for me to find amusement in that scenario. So that gets me to a sort of related question. So in the related to human theory of humor, you said that sometimes why people do not find something funny is not because there isn't a fun-making feature. It might be because they don't have a developed, refined, unobstructed sense of humor. So some kind of refinement could help us to improve the sense of humor. But that case seems to raise a question there, because in that case, it might be that suppose there's somebody who saw the scenario, the lady scenario, and does not find it funny, maybe because that person doesn't feel anxiety in the first place. It's precisely because that person lacks a sort of empathy or sympathy on other people. It's not so. There are two ways to catch this out. One way is to say, okay, there is an independent sense of humor, which is distinct from the sense of empathy, or the kind of a sensitivity to other people's safety. But there could equally be a kind of a picture where some people might say, well, the reason why this person lacks a sense of humor is because that person is not empathetic to lacks empathy in that case. So I guess the related question is, then if that is the case, then how do we distinguish those? Because you said there are obscuring factors, right? Such as moods, altered state of minds, and ideological biases. Then how do we distinguish between those obscuring factors and those seems to be constituting factors in our refinement? I wonder if you could say a bit more about that. Okay, so now let me get to my second question. Now, suppose we accept what I just said. That is, sometimes the current mood, such as anxiety, plays an indispensable role in whether we feel funny or not. But maybe the same thing can be said about moral beliefs. And I think you, in chapter 4, you mentioned meanness, and sometimes you seem to suggest that some kind of immorality sort of is also fun making, or is a prerequisite or is an element of some fun making feature, right? So it seems that you are open to this view. And but let's consider the particular case you mentioned. So the what may the battered woman case, right? What do 10,000 battered women have in common? They should have listened. And you mentioned that, well, the joke itself is we don't know about whether it's moral or not. Depends on how it is told, right? So and so you tried to use this case to address an objection that sometimes immorality kills the funniness, and you want to say, well, not necessarily. So in one scenario, the joke is told by a male sexist to another male sexist, and you say that the funniness lies in the subversion of the expectation. Because the sexist would say, "Oh, of course, they would say that, right?" So that's what makes it funny. It's a subversion of the expectation. But when the joke is told by a good-willed non-sexist to other non-sexist, you think this can still be funny. You also said that the funniness also lies in the subversion of their expectations, but you said more. It's the caricature of the sexist silly or idiocracy in their mindset, right? So only the sexist would make such silly presumption that this is obvious. Nobody else would think it's obvious. Okay, now in that case, I think some ideological presumptions seems to be necessary for each party to find the joke funny in their respective scenario. For example, if the sexist does not believe that women should have listened, otherwise they would be battered, they wouldn't find this subversion of expectation fun, so they wouldn't find it funny there. And on the other hand, if those non-sexist would not reject that there is an obvious connection between these two, they also wouldn't find this joke funny in their own way. So it seems that their moral beliefs is the respective moral beliefs are necessary in their finding the joke funny in each scenario. If that is the case, so then I have two questions, right? So the one question is that although you reject the hardcore moralism, I wonder if there could be a more restricted version of hardcore moralism, which does not say blameworthy immorality makes any wisecracker non-funny, but instead it says that blameworthy immorality, some blameworthy immorality would make the funny-making feature gone, because some funny-making feature presupposes a certain kind of moral belief or morality, more moral virtue. Right. So that is the first question. And second question is, I wonder if there is a potential challenge to universalism. So if holding certain moral views is a precondition for finding something funny, and cultural relativism about moral beliefs is true, then it follows that there might be fun-making features for some cultures which cannot be recognized by other cultures as fun-making. So could that be a problem? So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. There is a lot to chew on here. Let me start with the second one because it's more succinct and I can answer it more quickly. So you're right, and this goes to some of the elements in the first question as well, that I am presupposing something similar with respect to morality that I do about humor, that there's a kind of universalism, and that more carefully and technically in the way I'm changing my way of thinking as I think more about these issues, that the reasons for moral upset, the reasons to blame, say, that's what I'd rather focus on. These are the properties that can be in the funny thing that give you reason to be amused, but may also give you reason to be morally upset. And I think those kinds of reasons are of exactly the same kind of, are exactly the same ilk as the comic reasons. That is to say, I have a optimistic universalism about that. And so I don't believe cultural or moral relativism, at least when it comes for reasons to be morally upset or reasons to blame. Okay. I've never made any of that explicit, but until now. So thank you for forcing me to make that explicit. So that's why I would say that I would want to deny your attempted move to go with a non-universalism because of the possibility of cultural moral relativism. I just deny that. Now,
Okay.
metaphysics scares me, and I try to avoid it when I can, but I'll try to lay out the view and then you tell me where the issue might lie here. So I'm thinking of the funny as, yes, in a way, a single unified property, but it's an evaluative property. And so that evaluative property may have as its constituents a whole bunch of natural properties. So I'm seeing a set of natural properties in a comic light. And if I'm amused by them, then I'm appraising them as funny. And so then it has that single evaluative property. But I can look at those exact same natural properties and appraise them as well as blameworthy, morally upsetting, or at least some of those natural properties as when they're together, I have reason to be morally upset. And then the question is, do I have more reason to be morally upset or more overall reason to be amused? So, and then the morally upsetting or the blameworthy, that's also an evaluative property as well, single evaluative property. So two distinct evaluative properties can come out of the same set of natural properties. And some of those are going to be emphasized more. Some of those natural properties are going to be emphasized more by the blameworthy side and some by the comic side. So if I'm mocking you in a particularly nasty way, or lots of people are laughing at you, among those natural properties will be that you're feeling psychological pain, I assume. You felt the sting. And I might take from that, just focus on that to say, oh, but that's a reason to be morally upset. Whereas the structure and connection of other properties, along with your having felt that sting, contribute to my having the comic reason. I am amused and I appraise it as amusing. Is that good with your metaphysical picture so far?
Sure.
Or okay, all right. So then you get to, well, first of all, I want to say the JD Vance, the response of the blogger was actually hilarious, and it's because it's obviously making a callback to Vance's questions of the Ukrainian president and the Oval Office. I see this was a nice little callback there, but I think the harder question and maybe the hardest question of all is how to differentiate between something's being an obscuring factor that I need to eliminate in order to see the comic more clearly versus it's being a crucial part of the context in which I have the comic reason. Is that a fair way to put this point?
Right. Yes.
Okay. And that's a terribly difficult question. I'm not sure. I think what we are doing, the best way to get at this is to think about what we're doing when I'm trying to explain to you why something was funny. Now you switched up the zone, so I'll look at a different part of my computer. So I'm laughing at some event and you come along and say, what's so funny? And I'm trying to explain it. What I'm doing in appealing to the explanation has nothing to do with my mood, my anxiety, maybe. So I think as part of the explanation, what we're doing is already stripping away, or we're not including obscuring factors. But what I might do is also say, but I mean, he gets so embarrassed so easily when we make fun of him in this way, and that just increases the funniness. I am making reference to somebody's psychological state, maybe somebody's anxiety, but I'm not making reference to mine. I'm not saying I was so anxious going in here, and then I saw her do the dance on the ice, and it was funny. What I think explains that case is actually what Freud was trying to do in offering his theory of the funny, which is a relief or a release view, that we got all this anxiety built up, and that what happens is it's released. Well, that's not really a theory of the amusing or the funny. It's a theory of laughter, I think. And so I think that in saying, why did you laugh? Now I have to make reference to things like, I was so anxious, I was so nervous for her, and then this thing happened, and whew, that's why I laughed. But that's not necessarily to say that what I'm doing, what I saw was funny. That maybe I saw the same thing as the person across the street who didn't have the anxiety, and that's why they don't see it as funny either. So what's essential in all this is to separate out reasons and explanations for laughter from justifying reasons for amusement. And I think in doing that, we get a clue how to differentiate between obscuring factors and contextual factors by the kinds of reasons that we point to in explaining why things are funny. Now, this is just a rough and ready way of proceeding, but I think that that's one way to go. But I think you're exactly right that there are going to be shades of gray here between the context, the contextual situation, and the comic or the obscuring factors, and I just don't have a principled way yet to differentiate those.
Okay, can I add one
Yeah,
more?
please.
So suppose the moral beliefs or the moral reasons you find, or the moral positions you hold, and the funniness you feel, they are sort of psychologically interconnected. Do you worry that might pose a threat to this comic and moral reason distinction? If not, why not?
So that, I want to get clear on this. So that, in general, when I see things as funny, I've got a moral sensibility that enables me to see it as funny. Is that the thought?
Right. So there's some
am
moral
I going to differentiate?
And the sense of humor, maybe they're sort of psychologically connected. Without a moral sensitivity, you wouldn't sense the funniness, or without your sense of funniness or the non-funniness, you wouldn't have this proper sense of morality.
Yeah.
So suppose that is true, or maybe that's not true. Suppose that true. Does that cause a problem to the dichotomy you are proposing?
I see. No, I don't think so. But I think the mistake that I made in Wisecracks is to continue to call these moral reasons, and I don't think that they are. I don't think that the blamey reasons, as I much now prefer to think of them, are coextensive with immorality. I think we have reasons to be upset, morally upset, or to blame someone, even if they haven't lived up to our best expectations, say. I bring my wife home some crappy flower for our anniversary. I've given her a gift, and I haven't violated any moral principles. But nevertheless, I think she sees a good reason to be upset with me for not having lived up to the ideals of the situation. So that allows me then to say that, yes, a good moral sensibility is going to contribute to a good sense of humor. I really do think that, and I think it's because they share the need for a finely tuned mechanism of empathy. So to be a good moral person requires empathy. To be a good to have a good sense of humor requires a fine-tuned sense of empathy, and it's not a coincidence that they overlap. But that may be independent from my being sensitive to reasons to blame people. There's going to be heavy-duty overlap there, but they're going to be separate, and that's because these are two different things. Moral reasons give me reason to do something, or to feel something, or to have perform some action or attitude. These blamey reasons are reasons only to respond in a certain kind of way to a set of properties. So they're just different. And so I could have the finely tuned sense of morality, finely tuned sense of comedy, and yet also, and that moral sensitivity is what enables me to see the funny in the thing, right? But it may also generate some kinds of reasons to blame or reasons to be morally upset as a result. And this is borne out by the expressions that we have when we see something that has both comic reasons and blamey reasons together. And that's that kind of a kind of cringy laughter or amusement there's an emotional tug of war that's happening in that case. I'm being tugged by the reasons to be upset, and I'm also being tugged by the reasons to be amused. And that can happen with people of very delicate and refined moral sensibilities. I hope that's clear.
Okay,
May not
yeah,
be fully
that
responsive.
helps a lot. Yeah, that helps a
Okay,
lot.
good.
Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah, I'm done. Yanhan or Paul. Oh, by the way, my name is Xiaofei. Sorry.
Yes.
Paul asked me to say a few words about myself. I'm a professor at Wuhan University. I works on moral responsibility as well.
Yeah.
Great
Great.
pleasure.
Oh, yeah, I'm so sorry, Professor Liu and everyone. The signal was interrupted. I'm so sorry for that.
It's okay.
No worries.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, and thank you to all our participants for these rich discussions. Now we still have 20 minutes remaining for questions. And I saw that Professor Muller have a question from the chat. So Professor Muller, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Professor Shoemaker, for your presentation and also for the presentations by the other contributors, which I appreciated a lot, especially relevant from my perspective were the first two by Johanna and Dimitra. Since this is an online event, I was actually, while you were talking, Professor Shoemaker, I was checking the Wikipedia entry on Islam and humor. And I was not surprised to find that the Wikipedia entry is mostly about discussions among what may be called Islamic theologians if humor is halal or haram. That is, if it's religiously okay or not. And my impression about your project from both your presentation, I admit I didn't read the book, but my impression from your presentation as well as to the responses from your responses was that your project is somewhat comparable to the Islamic theologians talking about humor, namely that you are trying to assess the moral quality of humor. This is the kind of theme that everything revolves around, at least in your presentation and the discussions. And it seemed to me that you're particularly interested in showing that those aspects of humor that tend to get dismissed as immoral or amoral may also have good moral qualities. As you said, like several times, for instance, at the very end of your presentation, you said there are moral benefits to some kinds of humor that we normally don't see. Now, again, this reminds me very much about the discussions that I informed myself about during your speech among the Islamist theologians, which I think also have a correspondence in Christian theology, because as far as I remember, that's also a theme in Christianity. Like there were some people, for instance, who assumed that Jesus never laughed. So it seems that your project is not religious, but civil religious, and that you're kind of trying to do a halal haram assessment, not in a religious, but in a civil religious moralistic framework. And interestingly, I think the greatest parallel, or one of the major parallels, is in your response to Dimitra, where you kind of emphasized that you also claim a universalist position, which I think you share with the Islamist approach, which because of course they try to find out God's position, which is a universal position. So I think that is a second kind of parallel. And this also relates directly to the point that was made by Dimitra. I think that is an interesting thing that probably also an Islamist theoretician of humor would probably also claim that their position is universalist, and they would probably also deny a kind of a relativist, as you called it, understanding of humor. Yeah. Well, to me, it seems that both these religious and civil religious haram, halal centered or moralistic centered approaches towards humor run into these problems that they, on the one hand, must claim a universalist basis, but that I find this problematic. And I also somehow think that both approaches somehow miss what I would personally regard as key features from a hermeneutic perspective, and maybe also from an actual philosophical perspective on humor.
Okay, thank you very much. Two things, I think. I feel the force of the suggestion or the comparison to this being a kind of civic religion, secular religion, maybe. I prefer my reasons for it than I do the reasons for the Islamists. So, or those who are studying Islam. My claim to universalism comes from the thought that there are several emotional responses that do seem universally present in the species, pan-culturally. And these include things like anger, fear, disgust, and amusement. And so I find it highly unlikely that amusement is going to respond to things that are just no match for our sensibilities. I think that in the case of amusement, we have a powerful case for thinking that amusement was built for us. We weren't built for the amusement. And so we can't talk about the nature of the funny without talking about the human sense of humor. And it's a human sensibility. It's a sense, I think, I argue in the sixth chapter. It's a way of perceiving the world. And so in that sense, it's a sense just like sight and taste and smell and so forth. So I think there is good reason to consider that, given that this response is universal in the species, that there might also be universal standards or for appropriateness of the response in the species as well. As I say, the view is compatible with there being maybe radical disagreement, but there's going to be a lot more agreement, I think, once we rid ourselves of various obscuring factors than we had thought. And so that's part of the project of the book. So the other point, though, about the kind of religious aspect to the view is the one that I find more something that resonates with what I'm doing is that in the last chapter, I do talk about Thomas Nagel's discussion of the absurd. And there's absurdity in life, which is just mismatch between pretension and reality. And there's absurdity of life, which is distinctive, again, to the species because of our capacity for self-reflection and our capacity to disengage from the things that we think matter. So on the one hand, we're fully engaged in the things in the projects that we've got. They give us reasons to get out of bed in the morning. They're the things that matter to us. It's our family and friends and all of our pursuing our careers and so forth and so on. And we can disengage from that and we can remove ourselves all the way, one could say, to the perspective of the God's eye view, or the perspective of the universe, or the perspective subspecie aeternitatis, the famous phrase. And when we look at ourselves from that perspective, we see that we're located in a very specific place and time. We were born to very specific parents. We've got the values and projects and beliefs that we've got because we were born into that very specific place and time. And if we'd been born, setting aside the metaphysical worries, Xiaofei, that we'd been born into a different place in time to different parents, we would have had very different projects that we would have been pursuing with exactly the same zeal and earnestness. And it's possible then that in the scope of all eternity, we're just like a bunch of ants carrying stones 3 times our body weight into an anthill with a queen, and it could be driven over by a tractor tomorrow or blown away by the winds of time. Now, that means then that maybe nothing means anything. Maybe nothing matters at all. And there is a kind of cosmic insignificance there that's genuinely possible. And if it turned out that we're all pursuing this stuff with such earnestness and meaning, and this includes the religious meaning, but also moral meaning, and it turns out that it's possibly all for naught, it's just a waste, that's a big joke. And that's the source of a kind of cosmic, absurd humor that we can only get in virtue of being human beings who have the capacity to reflect in this way on ourselves. So there's religious elements there somewhere, but it's certainly not any specific kind of religious view, and it's not a theistic kind of religious view. But it is to say, here's our condition, and our condition may be one big fat joke. What's the best response? Amusement. So I don't know if this goes into all the details of the question, but I just wanted to say that I feel the force of, let's see what the right answer is from the God's eye view, but in my view, just point of view of the universe, a completely removed kind of perspective. And from there we can see this may all be pointless and My God, how hilarious would that be? Thank you for your question.
Thank you for your response. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Muller, Professor Shoemaker. Now we still have a little bit of time. Does anyone have a question that you would like to ask? Or maybe our discussants still want to follow up? Okay. Okay.
Yeah, maybe I can follow up. If it's possible. So,
Since oh yeah.
So I have a question concerning taking offense by jokes, because it seems, at least for me, that in the book, Professor Shoemaker mentioned that yes, there are pricks who can be overly sensitive to certain topics due to ideological basis, and it is presumed that they do this in good faith, like that they have some impairments with their moral judgment, and they actually, their feelings can be heard, or maybe they do this on behalf of someone else and they feel like someone else was being wronged. But how about cases where offense taken was made with the pursuit of some ideological goals, so as a strategy, as a certain type of political strategy, for example. And as you mentioned in your book, that wisecracks, they tend to unite people, but at the same time, taking offense collectively by something can also unite people. So what are your thoughts about it? Is this even relevant? Is this relevant to the discussion of wisecracks, whether the reaction is sincere or not?
Yeah, well, that is the question. I think it's definitely relevant. Ginned up anger, ginned up amusement. These are the kinds of things that can be used strategically. And humor cuts to the bone sometimes, and it can be norm pushing or it can be norm conserving. And there may be various strategic reasons to respond with offense in a way that you can stand by many people who can also get ginned up with offense in a way that will quiet, silence, push back those who are pushing norms that you think are no good. I think those kinds of they are responses to reasons, but I think they're responses to what's known as wrong kinds of reasons. It's a terrible label because it means that it seems to suggest you shouldn't adhere to those reasons, but all it really means is those are reasons that are coming from a different domain, a different value domain than the one we were in. And the one we were in was just about comedy. And the question is, do you have reasons to be amused by that? And if you think, well, I know what they're trying to do here with this comedy, and I think we need to band together to fight against it, then maybe somehow getting yourself to feel offended in a way that other people can share is a reason from morality. It's not a reason from comedy. It's a reason from a separate domain, but it might work. All I'm trying to do is say, and so I think that can be a good strategy, and it was a decent strategy against Andrew Dice Clay eventually. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with his case, but was a comedian who was playing a kind of character, a stereotypical Brooklyn guy. And I think the comedian got carried away because he was presenting to in front of huge crowds at some point. And he got carried away with the misogyny bit in the humor and lost a bit of the humor in favor of the rallying cry. And I think that a lot of people just said enough is enough. And so we're protesting, and he eventually went away. So there may be good reasons to try to band together and be very upset at the kind of effects that this humor is having on a bunch of young men. And so seem to respond to the humor with offense when what you're doing is really responding to the consequences. And as I say, there's the wrong kinds of reasons, but they're perfectly legitimate kinds of reasons sometimes. But then there are also going to be wrong kinds of reasons for taking things lightly in an amusing way that people are thinking is terribly morally serious. And the effort is also going to be to change norms, to say that we know you think that you're being kind in always saying, "Oh, don't make fun of that. That's terrible. You should not be amused by that situation. That was horrible what happened to you." There is great value in being amused and being able to see events that have happened to you that might have been traumatic, but be able to see them in a more comic light because it helps you to move on. And in those kinds of cases, the person who's insisting, "Oh, you poor dear, how can you make fun of that?" That person, I think, is being immoral. I know that's a weird thing to say. They think they're being kind, but they're in fact not. What I'm inviting them to do is to be amused along with me. That is to say, to be a little more callous, emotionally callous, so that we can both move past this event. And so by emphasizing all the values, I think, and benefits that are associated with a certain kind of humor, absurdist, self-deprecatory, there are powerful, wrong kinds of reasons to go in both directions, I think. Sometimes to gin up the offense, but also to gin up the amusement, because in very valuable ways. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Shoemaker.
Thank you.
Okay, I think our time has come to an end. Once again, a heartfelt thanks to Professor Shoemaker, Dr. Gomes, Professor Amarantidou, and Professor Liu for your invaluable insights. And thank you to everyone joining us today. Professor D'Ambrosio, do you have any final remarks before we conclude?
Oh, that was a great session. So thank you guys very much. And we'll see you in the next四海为学 events.
Thanks to all of you. This was super helpful, and I really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot. Great to meet you all.
Thank you so much, Dave.